Hello, bruvs. We're back with Beer Money, a memoir of privilege and loss by Frances Stroh, who obviously was an heir to the Stroh brewery fortune. I think her and her brother are still fighting over it in court. I was going to go out and find the re the reintroduced Stroh beer and drink some of it as I read, but I said, why bother? I left Michigan on a bone chilling morning. My mother took us to the airport, and Arcady flew on to New York to see his brothers. My mother waited with me at the gate for my flight to San Francisco. She sat knitting a baby blanket for her friend's grandchild and talked about how awful the weekend had been with Charlie there. After the meeting, she told me he'd gotten drunk and made a scene in the lobby of the River Place Inn, shouting at the people checking into their rooms about Jesus and redemption. It's just dreadful how he acts when he's been drinking, she said, her knitting needles clicking away in a steady rhythm. It's terribly embarrassing. Poor thing, he just can't control himself. It's like Jekyll and Hyde. I listened as she knitted herself back together with absolute truths, the baby blanket draping over her lap ever as it ever so slowly grew. She had reconstructed the weekend so seamlessly. I almost found myself believing it, too. Charlie was the problem. Wait, is this the end of the chapter? I guess it is. The day before, the hotel had called my mother about his minibar bill, with the family company, which the family company had a policy of not covering. She had called Charlie immediately. Charlie, your minibar bill is $160. How can you possibly drink that much in 2 days? You're a fucking bitch, he shouted. My mother told me. The rest she wouldn't repeat. My mother had hung up the phone, dialed the front desk of the hotel, and given them Bill Penner's number. He was drunk, she explained now as the gate filled with people. Look, he's very sweet when he's sober, but when he's drunk, it's simply terrible. Seeing how drained my mother looked, how the events of the weekend had worked her over emotionally, I pitied her nearly as much as I did Charlie. I only wish she could see the truth that all the brushes with the law, the boozing and the drugs, the slow motion suicide, these were Charlie's cries for help. Even now, he was challenging her to love him. In spite of everything, he was still her child. The crowds milled past. Beer Money, Frances Stroh, a memoir of privilege and loss. The crowds milled past. It was a beer company in Detroit, and since I'm from the Detroit area, it's pertinent to me. Probably not as much to you. The crowds milled past us on the way to their gates, listening to the boarding announcement for the first class passengers on my flight. I knew I had about 10 more minutes before it was my turn to board, and I could put this weekend behind me. My mother suddenly tensed and dropped her knitting. There's Charlie, she said in a hollow voice. There he was, not 20 feet from us, trailing through the airport, glancing around absently, unshaven and seeming almost lost. His ruined face struck me now as open and curious, an expression of almost childlike innocence. Startled, we instantly looked away, perhaps because we were tired or because he wasn't the person we'd spent the morning recreating in our thoughts. Standing there as a physical fact, he was just a person in the world with a hangover and a plane ticket, a brother, a son, and yet someone to be kept at a distance. My mother and I looked at each other, ashamed. Let's say goodbye to him, I finally said, halfway out of my seat. My mother's hand clenched my forearm. No, Francis, I can't take anything more. Please, just let him go. I turned my head stricken and watched Charlie wander off to his gate, disappearing into the crowd. He glanced our way, but his eye never caught mine. Had he seen us? Perhaps it didn't matter. The moment was lost. I gathered my purse, boarded my flight, and just before takeoff, vomited in the jet's toilet. It was the last time we ever saw him. What's up, Brubs? Did she say it was the last time she ever saw Charlie? I think it was. It was the last time we ever saw him. Yeah. That's the end of Charlie. Flowers. Charlie Stroh, 1970. Damn, he looks like a little kid there. What's up, Bubba? San Francisco, 2003. Can't wait for this book to end, honestly. I hate its living guts. The phone rang out into the sun-filled room, and I answered quickly, taking care not to disturb the baby next to me on the sofa. It was Charlie's voice on the line. "Franny, I'm at the Hyatt in Dallas," he said, "with my new lady." "Here, talk to her." Nothing's worse than someone calling you and say, "Hey, talk to my new girlfriend." I lay on my side with the phone balanced at my... Does that say eat? Oh, it says ear. My tiny, blue-veined son slept in the hollow of my armpit. Suddenly, an unfamiliar female voice greeted me, and we exchanged friendly words before Charlie returned to the line. "Her old man's threatening to kill me," he said, with an unmistakable thrill in his voice. He's circling the parking lot in a Hummer with a shotgun in the front seat. "Maybe you should call the police," I said, my body tensing. Mishka squirmed in the crease of my arm and began to cry. I wondered if Charlie was just high, or whether there was in fact a real threat. Arkady, I think that's how you say it, was cooking borscht in the kitchen, and I nearly called out to him. "Did you get the flowers?" Charlie suddenly asked. Those were Roxanne's idea. I looked over at the flowers sitting on a table, a melange of pink roses, baby's breath, singular, sorry, and daffodils. "I love them," I told him. "You're the only one who sent me flowers." "Yeah? Well, I can't wait to meet my nephew," said Charlie, his voice bursting with pride. "I'll come visit you in June, I promise." Though Charlie had never come to see me in San Francisco, we talked on the phone reasonably often. A few years before I moved here, he told me he'd taken a floor of rooms at the Fairmont Hotel and thrown a raging party. Good times. "I'm going to hold you to that, Charlie," I said before getting off the phone, almost believing he would come. "Okay, so I'll see you in June then." Charlie had taken to migrating from one Dallas hotel to the next, moving on when he'd worn out his welcome. Bill Penner, who by now had become a father figure for him, not only paying the bills but also offering him much needed guidance, was the only one who knew his whereabouts on a consistent basis. "Charlie's a damn nice guy," Bill would say to me over the phone when I'd call him to check on Charlie. "Shame he doesn't have a better relationship with your dad." My father's attitude toward Charlie had only further soured over the years. In his mind, the second-born son seemed to represent all his own failures as a human being. "I wish I could push a button and just make him disappear," my father said more than once. Both my parents had completely detached themselves from Charlie. "I had to create distance," my mother said. "It's the only way I can live." It was 3 years since she'd spoken with him, since the family meeting. June came and went in a blur of sleepless nights with Mishka feeding every 2 hours. I'm taking that's her daughter. In my delirium, I would flash to his April birth, the midwife coaxing me out of our bathtub and onto the bed as I labored, coaching me in her heavy German accent to push. Arkady brought aromatic herbs and berries from the kitchen, distracting me from the agony. And the breaks between contractions had felt glorious, an intense endorphin high, what I imagined heroin must be like. Yes, yes. When Mishka arrived, Arkady and I looked at each other and laughed out loud, then cried. The midwife placed our baby's body on my stomach, and my love flared, fierce and unconditional. Then she sewed me up by the light of our living room lamp. Wait, she had it at home? with the shade removed while Mishka blindly navigated my chest. I never remembered to call Charlie about his visit. Maybe I'd never really believed it would happen. We could go years, after all, without seeing each other. The distance had come to feel normal. Normal. And then one windswept day in July, the phone rang. All day something had felt off. A weight, a fatigue, something beyond the usual. Mishka was napping in the bedroom, so I picked up in my writing office. Frances, said my mother, her voice tight. How are you? It wasn't a question. Fine, I said. Then she told me, her voice artificially calm, matter of fact, that Charlie was dead. He had been staying at an Embassy Suites hotel in Dallas on the 10th floor. According to the police report, Charlie had called the front desk of the hotel shouting for help. Someone was chasing him. He'd insisted trying to kill him. The hotel sent the police up to his room to investigate. When two policemen arrived, they found a paranoid man who believed he was being pursued. Opening the closets for Charlie, they reassured him that he was alone in the room and safe. Charlie seemed calmed. One of the policemen patted him on the shoulder, told him to take care, and then they left. The police took the elevator down to the lobby, spoke for some minutes to the hotel manager, and then exited the hotel. At the very moment they stepped outside, a large mass, tangled in a white sheet, fell from the sky, landing onto the pavement in front of them with a horrible thud. They looked up. Torn bed sheets, tied together and fashioned into a makeshift rope, dangled from the balcony of a room on the 10th floor. My mother sat knitting in the living room of my apartment, her face sagging in a way it never had. The eyes uneven, the skin of the cheeks thickened. Mishka was draped across her chest, asleep. It wasn't suicide, she said. No, Charlie fucking just suddenly flew out the window, she said. It wasn't suicide, she said, her knitting needles clicking. He was trying to escape. Who said it was suicide, I asked. We'd all assumed, on the basis of the police report, that Charlie had been attempting to escape his imaginary pursuer by making a rope out of bed sheets and lowering himself off the balcony. One of your cousins, said my mother, but it wasn't. I watched my mother cradle Mishka with her arm as she knit him a blanket. Her first grandchild, this visit, long planned, had taken on a dual purpose, and she looked at once totally wrecked and wholly content. I know it wasn't, I said. I was stroking the logs in the fireplace, thinking of that line apocryphally attributed to Mark Twain. The coldest winter I've ever spent was a summer in San Francisco. Arcadia had driven the three of us to Big Sur the day after receiving the news. In the evening, I'd walked with our new baby down some stone steps to a hot spring, resting him inside his Moses basket, and looked up at the sweeping dome of stars. Waves crashed on the sides of the cliffs below, one after the other. It all felt vast. The sky, the rocks, the ocean, vast and oppressive. The service will be in Grosse Pointe in September, my mother was saying now. He's being cremated. I didn't want to know any details about the body, what condition it had been in, how it had been shipped back to Michigan. Nor did my mother ever think to mention these things. Bill Penner, I imagined, had handled everything. What a shitty place to die. What, in a hotel? Or Michigan? Where was he at? In Dallas? He was at a Dallas hotel. I think it was a suite, though. Suites, right? I think it was a nice place. I don't know. She said it was like a hotel and suite. So it was probably a nice suite. Embassy Suites Hotel. Aren't those nice? Aren't they? Hell of a nice guy, Bill said when we spoke just after I received the news. I could tell he'd been crying. I'll sure miss him. I don't know. I've never been to one. I always went to like Motel 6s because I'm cheap. Plus, you're just fucking sleeping. So will I. I myself had been unable to cry. I kept telling myself we'd always known something like this was coming. But the guilt I shouldered now was, in truth, too much to feel. Have you spoken with Whitney? Asked my mother. I crossed the room and sat down in a chair. He's holed up in Missoula, I said, getting a couple of summer school credits to finish college. He was so upset he had his girlfriend fly out to be with him, said my mother. He's taken this very hard. For all his bravado, Whitney could be deeply sensitive. I remembered how we'd both cried quietly in the car the year before, just after we'd visited Uncle Peter, who'd been diagnosed with a brain tumor. The three of us had sat together in Peter and Nicole's living room, while Nicole talked on the phone upstairs. Outside the bay window, the golf course burst with savage green, cruel beyond measure in its vibrant health. Peter sat quietly in his tweed jacket and gray flannels, slightly shrunken, unable to make the usual conversation. The poor man was stunned, having received the terrible news only days before. You're going to be okay, Peter, I told him, putting my hand on his, echoing his words to me all those years before. He looked at me with those warm, small eyes for the last time. Thank you, Franny, he said, managing a smile. 4 months later, he died. Mishka gurgled, and my mother adjusted him gently. I poked at the logs to get the embers going again. And Bobby, have you spoken with him? My mother asked. I called him as soon as I heard, I said. I didn't tell her, though, what Bobby had said. Charlie was a fool right up until the end. I knew his callousness toward Charlie was only a defense. Like my father's, still it hurt to hear it. Bobby's handling of the situation, like my parents', disturbed me almost as much as my own behavior did. We'd all distanced ourselves rather brutally, it seemed to me. Charlie's neediness reminded us of our own frailties, and we'd hated him for it. Poor Charlie, was all that my father had said when I called him from Big Sur, which is a nice place. I've been there a couple times. A whole lifetime of regret in those 3 worn syllables. My mother put down her knitting. Her gaze drifted to the crackling hand on Mishka's back and closed her eyes. I went over and spread a blanket across them both. I mean, they were all rich. Now, as you can see, the ending here, they're broke. They blew the Ford. Well, they didn't blow it. Their parents did. Wyoming, 2007, by Eric Stroh. That's her father. He was like the last descendant who worked at the brewery in Detroit. And there's the train. Wish the train would go all day and night. The weird thing is it seems to wait till night, then it just goes on and on. Grosse Pointe, 2008. My father, 5-year-old Mishka, and I sat at a table having dinner at the Hill, the restaurant where you are when you weren't at the club. Dark paneling, starched linen tablecloths, weighty cutlery, a bread basket heaping with gnarled rolls. How the hell can a roll be gnarled? That resembled tightly wound fists. We'd flown into Detroit for 24 hours on our way from New York to San Francisco. I can't sleep, my father was saying, visibly irritated. I'm so damned wound up. He was drinking club soda. Hey, isn't that what I have? No, I have tonic water. Since his divorce from... Oh, he divorced Alyssa? What? Since his divorce from Melissa, his stomach couldn't take the alcohol anymore. Instead, he took painkillers. I did not know he divorced Alyssa. Alyssa was his daughter's high school classmate. He must have been reading his mail. Usually, I was the one who filled him in on the grim news that arrived in the quarterly reports from the family holding company. The most recent had warned that dividends would be entirely eliminated in a few months, leaving my father to live on nothing more than his small pension. 16 years after our final listing in Forbes, the coffers were empty. Yeah, what's wrong with that? I like it. It tastes like it's like pop, but without the fucking. You probably say soda, but it's like pop without the fucking whatever you want to call it. I just like the taste. It's like bitter. Bitter. What can you call it? Like bitter lemons. Dad, you'll be okay. I reassured him. But we both knew he had non negotiable financial obligations, both to my mother and to Alyssa. To cover these, he likely would be forced to sell his house in a real estate market depressed beyond recognition by the bankrupt automotive industry, burning up what little he had left in those family trusts that Bill Penner had agonized over 12 years before. I started drinking it because it's good for cramps, leg cramps, and arm cramps, and shit like that. But then I just found out I was really low on potassium because I was drinking too much coffee and pissing. And then I basically had an irregular heartbeat because of low potassium. So it wasn't necessarily I was dehydrated. I just didn't have potassium for whatever reason. Anyway, that's my story of tonic water. I started drinking it and I like it. My mother would likely forgive the debt. Yeah, I believe I had more of a magnesium issue, but I was having weird like cramps in my legs for months and then it just suddenly went away. Doctors are absolutely worthless in diagnosing things. You kind of have to diagnose them yourself because with almost anything, every person's different. When you're like my potassium could be like 4.3 or whatever the level's supposed to be. Yours could be 4.8 and you could be having problems and I could be fine. And then whatever's not within that range, they can't comprehend it. What the hell does that say? Chat GPT? My mother would likely forgive the debt, but we were not counting on Alyssa, who had left him for another man less than a year ago, to do the same. My father slathered a roll with butter. I can't remember the last time I heard good news, he said. Whenever I open a goddamn letter, it's always doom and gloom. All the fears I'd ever felt about my own future paled in comparison to what I imagined he must be feeling about his. My father was not equipped, I knew, to live without a substantial income. I wondered if he would spend the rest of his life regretting his choices, or perhaps even wishing that he'd been born into another family, one that hadn't taken such good care of him up to now. That meeting in Bill Penner's office 12 years before had been the best thing that had ever happened to me. Since then, through my active investing, I parlayed a small investment account into a sizable nest egg. I still had my income from the Detroit Real Estate Trust, but I'd been informed that would soon end. No matter, striving for something gives life its meaning, regardless of whether we succeed or fail. The problem was, my father had never had to strive for anything. Looking over at Mishka, who was playing with the salt and pepper, I felt deeply grateful this would not be his fate. My father sipped his club soda. So, how's your book coming along? He asked, suddenly upbeat. Can I be a character in your great American novel? I was writing a novel set in the late 90s New York art world with an artist protagonist whose family had lost their wealth. I had stopped making installations years ago. Years ago. Now I just wrote about artists. Sure, I said to please him. Or maybe I'll start a new book with you as the main character. Pipe smoking old crowd, he chuckled. That kind of thing. I laughed. Exactly. Mishka was lining the silverware up across the table like a snake. He's a good looking boy, my father said, watching Mishka with admiration. Hope he turns out better than some of my kids did. Charlie, he meant, ever since stammering the words, poor Charlie, after we'd gotten the news. I hadn't heard him mention Charlie, except by indirect reference. He will, Dad. Mishka will turn out fine. Only it's harder to control them when they get older, he said wistfully, when you don't even know who their friends are. My father ran his hand like a big spider up Mishka's arm. Smiling like a kid himself, Mishka shrieked with laughter. and came around the table to hug his grandfather, his blond hair, the very color my father's had been before it turned silver. Women, that's the other problem, my father went on. They're after only one thing: pick you to the bone. Mom didn't, I reminded them. He lit a cigarette. Fair enough, he said. I'd spent the final year of my father's marriage agonizing over whether or not to tell him about Alyssa's affair. She'd asked my father for $6 million to build a boat and sail around the world with her new friend, and my father had taken this at face value. What? But when Alyssa attended Arcadie's yoga workshop in Mexico, one night at the bar, she bragged about her liaison. Eric would do anything for me, she told the group, between gulps from her Corona. She was drinking Corona in that fucking $6 million yacht. Because he doesn't know about Sailor Boy. My own marriage had been failing at the time. Financial stress had been hard on the relationship, as had trying to run a business together and taking care of a new baby. I hadn't had the bandwidth to grieve Charlie properly. What the hell does that mean? The bandwidth. I feared sometimes I might be carried away by the torrent of my own anger and sadness, and distance became my new mode of survival. All those unresolved feelings having calcified into a wall that kept everything out, even happiness. The withdrawal from the marriage happened over a period of years, and during that time both Arcadie and I hoped the distance was only temporary. Perhaps it had been easier to focus my attention on my father's problems. Then one day, when Mishka was almost 4, I called my father from an airport and told him that Arcadie and I would be separating. We'll remain good friends, though, I added, just as you and Mom always managed to. Alyssa's Alyssa's moving out too, my father said. He soon filed for divorce at Bill Penner's urging, and the round the world boat trip was canceled. No, she actually went on that boat trip because I looked this bitch up, and she went on that boat trip with that guy. We left the restaurant, my father, Mishka, and I, and drove out over to my father's house. The lush summer lawn out front in full bloom. For the first time in 13 years, there was no need to check my father's driveway for Alyssa's car, hoping she would be out. My father had just finished remodeling. How do you like it? He asked when we came inside. I peered into the living room from the hallway and spotted a real skeleton sitting in an upholstered armchair. My father had always been fascinated with skulls and bones, and often had a skull sitting on a bookshelf. It's beautiful, I said, reminded suddenly of his solemn statement about Alyssa 8 years before. If anything ever happened to her, I wouldn't be able to go on living. That's sad. A few months later, my father, by now suffering from diabetes, noticed an infection in his leg. An infected sore, hardly unusual in a diabetic, could have been treated easily enough, but he decided to let it go for months. Did he suppose he had lived long enough, or that living without money was a fate worse than death? Perhaps systemic gangrene seemed a better choice than poverty. Calling me late one night in San Francisco just to talk, he seemed uncharacteristically at peace. We discussed the weather and my book, avoiding entirely the subject of the business. I told him how much Mishka loved the toy electric car he'd sent for Christmas. For once, he didn't tell me to speak English. When I said Mishka instead of Michael, our running joke, we laughed a lot. He seemed almost high, in fact, unfettered. Something was wrong. Dad, it's late. What are you doing awake? I love you, Franny, he said then. I told him I loved him too, and clung to the silence that followed before he hung up, as if everything we'd ever wanted to say was there in that pause. When he collapsed on his bathroom floor 2 days later, Ingrid, his housekeeper, took him to the hospital. He forbade her to call anyone in the family. 1 week later, he died alone at 4 o'clock in the morning. There he is. Self-Portrait of Eric Stroh, 2004. I like this guy. I might research him. Alright, see how many more pages are left. I think it's about 10, right? Yeah, because I'm not reading the acknowledgments. In my father's house, just before the funeral, I noticed that the skeleton that had been sitting in the armchair was gone. I went and sat in its place, taking in the scene for the last time. Soon everything in the room would change. Several antique handguns sat on top of the mantel. Rare books filled the bookshelves. The 18th century celestial and terrestrial globes flanked the fireplace. And I was transported back to that Easter weekend long ago. I heard my father's shoes crunching the Manhattan pavement, felt his warm, protective grip on my hand, inhaled the exhaust from the taxis passing us on Park Avenue. My father looked down at me and smiled just before we crossed the street. Having fun, minuscule? He asked, clutching his hand more tightly. I told him I was. When my family filed into Christ Church, all stone inside, with mahogany pews, I kept my eyes down. The damp air seemed to have an electric charge. Feeling hundreds of eyes trained on us as we took our seats in the front row, I clung to the piece of paper on which I'd written my reflections on my father's talent and character, a crystallization of all his best qualities, but an honest one that acknowledged his difficult side as well. As the minister spoke, I thought about my father's ashes, which would go into a wall with a bronze plaque inside Christ Church's rose garden, the same wall where Charlie's ashes had been bricked in 5.5 years before. When I visited Charlie's place in the wall, I left flowers. For my father, I would leave Cuban cigars. And then it was my turn to speak. I walked over and took my place at the pulpit. The rustle of programs with my father's photograph on the front filled the church. I looked out at the crowd. Charlie and my father were not among them and never would be again. With difficulty, I began to read the piece I'd written on the plane. I talked about my father's talent as an artist and how photography had been one of the only ways he knew how to connect with others. I talked of how difficult he could be at times, but also about the sensitive, generous man who'd been hiding beneath that gruff exterior. I talked of his loneliness and how, like any of us, he'd only wanted to be happy. His heart had been like the shutter of his camera, opening wide for an instant, allowing the warmth of his spirit to escape into the room, however briefly. My eulogy done, I looked up and spotted Alyssa. Oh no, she's back. In the fourth row, her cheeks wet with tears. Had she recognized those same admirable qualities in my father? And had he left this? And had he felt this? Pardon. I don't know why I said left. I'm dyslexic, apparently. Many of the people in the church had not reached out to my father in years, not since his marriage to Alyssa. People were complicated. We failed ourselves and each other, but we were all here now. And so as Alyssa's eyes met mine, I smiled. Open a few windows, suggested Bobby. He, Whitney, and I had driven over to my father's house to sort through his collections. Let me get some air in here. Bobby's dark mustache had flecks of gray, and he wore the rope anklet that marked him as an islander. At the funeral, what the hell does that mean? At the funeral, his eulogy had made light of my father's punitive parenting style, recalling how, when we were kids, my father had jestingly referred to our house as Stalag Stroh, after the term used for German prisoner of war camps during World War II. Well, that's nice. Whitney opened the sliding glass doors leading to the terrace and went out to smoke a cigarette. He was in the midst of a drawn out divorce and looked tired, his handsome face sagging in the dim winter light. He settled into the chair where just a few months before my father had sat smoking a cigar and balancing Mishka on his knee. I wandered through my father's house, 18th and mid 19th century English antiques mixed with sumptuously upholstered chairs. Need a drink. And wildlife paintings in gilt frames. I had long ago left behind the world of monogram sweaters and award winning gardens that my father's classic taste evoked. Though my own rooms in San Francisco were peppered with English antiques I'd inherited from Stroh relatives over the years, never feeling I had the money to properly decorate, I'd been glad to take the furniture, though in my fantasy I lived in a house full of Gerhard Richter paintings, Eames chairs, and sleek sectional sofas. In my father's library, framed photographs of all of us at various life stages were mixed in with the books. I felt grateful that Charlie wasn't there to witness the absence of any shots of him as an adult anywhere in the house. Our studied smiles in the images covered over something else, a weight, an implicit knowledge that soon it would all come undone. And yet I felt a good deal lighter now. In all my weeping for my father over the previous days, I'd finally found the way to let Charlie go too. Grief was perhaps undifferentiated. I spotted the Dickens set, the one my father had purchased on our trip to New York when I was 6. The gold embossed spines of the volumes shimmered in the sunlight on his bookshelf. An apparition, a memory long locked away in a treasure chest, beheld once more. The house and most of its contents would soon be gone, just as the brewery was. We'd somehow allowed ourselves to be pinned into place by these things, and in our search for freedom, some of us had self destructed. I walked into the living room to find Whitney lining up my father's 6 most valuable oil paintings, leaning them against the back of the sofa. He'd brought them up from the safe in the basement and had removed their protective, acid free cloth covers, the same gilt frame paintings he had considered removing from the house just after my father died for fear their value would create an enormous tax burden to the estate. Later, after receiving the appraisal report from Dumonchel's, we realized his worries had been pointless. You choose first, I said. I had my eye on a rain drenched Paris street scene by the post war impressionist Edouard Cortez. My heart suddenly racing as if I were bidding at an auction. I was relieved when Whitney tagged the other Edouard Cortez of a Paris flower market. I chose the street scene, and so it went back and forth at each of us as each of us selected what we wanted. The air around us felt ignited, just as it had in the antique shops my father and I had once frequented. It wasn't that the paintings were so enormously valuable, but they were echoes, reminders, and this drove us on. When he'd finished, I moved my 3 paintings over to my designated corner of the living room, where I'd also placed the most valuable item in the house, a Martin guitar signed by Eric Clapton, bequeathed to Alyssa in the post-nuptial agreement. The guitar leaned against the chair back, its leather case open on the floor, its caramel-colored surface gleaming like polished amber. My brothers and I walked out of my father's front door for the last time, pausing on the stone steps. The shipping company had been informed of where the contents of the house would be transported. 22 Martin and Gibson guitars were headed to Groon's in Nashville to be sold on consignment. 97 antique guns were being trucked to Bonham's and Butterfield's in San Francisco for sale at their next auction. 40 Leica cameras were being shipped to Markin Camera in New York, and so on. With General Motors prepared to declare bankruptcy any day now, the suburban Detroit real estate market was at a record low. Ford and Chrysler, too, were struggling. In just 4 years, the value of my father's house had dropped some 70%. Nor was it just Michigan that was hurting in the aftermath of the Lehman Brothers debacle. We couldn't have chosen a worse time to sell the house and its contents. So why did you? Within a few weeks, we would also come to understand that our father's firearm collection was peppered with counterfeits. The $1 million pipe collection was worth all of $50,000. That's still a lot. And The guitars and cameras were worth considerably less than what he'd paid. I'd never liked this house, Whitney said, stamping out his cigarette on the driveway. Dad was never happy here, that's for sure. Whitney and Bobby stood under the eaves of the house on either side of the front door, as if keeping guard. Well, Dad lost everything while in this house, I said. And what did he have to look forward to? Bobby stepped onto the driveway. My father's favorite son, he'd always remained the most detached from the events that had led us to where we now stood. It's the end of an era, he agreed. Let's just hope there will be some value in all this when the dust finally settles. I pictured the house and its contents vanishing into a cloud of dust, 50 years of accumulation vaporized in an instant. Somehow the image made me feel even lighter. Soon I would be in the clear, taking a child's tentative first steps away from her parents' outstretched arms. The joy of walking itself, my true legacy. The three of us drove in silence to River Place for our final meeting with Bill Penner. The January roads lined with soot-encrusted drifts. Detroit's own Jack White thrashing on the radio, the way Iggy Pop and the Stooges once had. That was about the worst fucking line in the book I've ever read. Or the MC5. It was an event we'd been dreading for years, the reading of the will. Although, given that the company would soon be dissolved anyway, there was less to worry about. The Stroh Company's Inc. shares now worthless. The only wild cards were our father's settlement agreements with Alyssa and my mother. With any luck, his house and the cash he'd left in a bank account would cover those liabilities. Whitney and I were in the midst of our own divorces, and Bobby had just married his third wife. All of us were knee-deep in legal documents already, trying to find new beginnings. We drove through a residential Detroit neighborhood that looked like a checkerboard with missing squares. Whole blocks of abandoned houses had been leveled, while the remaining occupied houses stood alone like homesteads in Little House on the Prairie, each house sometimes an entire block from its next-door neighbor. With a population drop of over 50%, the city was returning the valueless land to farmland. Trying to consolidate the occupied area into a more sustainable footprint no longer could Detroit afford the trash collection, police force, and the fire protection, and so widespread in the area. And the grocery chains had fled the city because of the ever-rising crime, putting vegetables in high demand. Come springtime, grassroots, urban renewal groups would be working the fields, planting everything from romaine to rutabaga. Just surreal, I said, staring out the window. I mean, I can't believe we still own an office building down here. Bobby kept his eyes on the road. John's trying to get government leases now. He turned on the volume on the radio, but the city can't even afford the infrastructure upgrade to keep the stoplights running. Did you know they're trying to sell the entire stoplight grid to a private contractor? I knew our delayed response to Detroit's downfall was born of attachment, a resistance to change that was similar to my grandfather's refusal to water down the beer formula after the war, and to Uncle Peter's late entry into the light beer market. All this principled resistance, while in some way admirable, had ultimately led to the family's unraveling. Much like the automobile manufacturers here, we simply weren't nimble enough. We'd waited too long even to close our flagship brewery, and so 24 years later, still stubbornly anchored in the city where we'd made our name, we were subject to the vicissitudes of every economic contraction and political scandal. Our recently resigned mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick, convicted of obstruction of justice, assault of a police officer, racketeering, tax evasion, extortion, and mail fraud, had been the final leveling blow. Bobby turned up the car heater. We passed more snow-covered fields mixed in with houses, some of them torched. Burning down abandoned dwellings was entertainment in Detroit, like going to the movies. The arsonist would barbecue over the embers, swigging 40-ounce bottles of St. Ides or Schlitz malt liquor while sirens raged through the night. I don't know about that last part, but yeah. Bobby turned right onto Jefferson Avenue and heading toward downtown, we passed the site where Uniroyal had stood, its steel-lined walls built during World War II to withstand aerial bombardment. Once it had been a place of wonder as much as danger, the Badlands of Detroit capturing my imagination as a young artist. I wanted to make something lasting out of all this waste. I still did. Only I needed an ending, I felt, before I could begin. Perhaps this was it. Lately, I've been reading articles about other artists who were finding inspiration in Detroit. I hear a lot of artists are moving here, I told Bobby and Whitney. Can't argue with the rental rates, said Bobby. I hear the DIA is being renovated, Whitney chimed in from the back seat. And expanded, I said. They're spending like $158 million or something. Funded in its heyday by automotive and newspaper money, the Detroit Institute of Arts housed one of the most expansive collections in the world, ranging from ancient Egyptian works to contemporary art. The new Museum of Contemporary Art, Detroit, had recently been written up in the New York Times, putting Detroit back on the map art-wise. The city seemed overrun with artisans or artists setting up studios in abandoned buildings, showing their work in makeshift galleries and sipping fair trade coffee. Fair trade coffee in what looked like domestic war zones. They too believed in the redemptive power of danger. These gutsy people forging a life with no certainties, the kind of life Bernard Stroh had opted for back in 1850, when the water in Detroit tasted so fresh. Turning left onto Joseph Campo, Bobby continued down to Stroh River Place and parked next to the river in the same lot where Coleman Young and Uncle Peter had once made their deal. The fact that we still owned and parked in this lot was proof that things had not gone as planned along the riverfront. In every other American city, waterfront lots were prime real estate, developed into high-end residential and commercial areas. Not so in Detroit. Not so. Our waterfront parcel had actually plunged in value since that fateful day, 25 years ago, when those two city fathers shook hands on a future that was never to be. I looked around at the handful of parked cars, studying our acreage of buckling concrete, trying to picture a field of corn in its place. The idea was kind of hopeful. Anybody could see it was time to start over. P.S. Wait, she fucking does an author interview at the end? I view the memoir as a love letter to my past. 6 books that influenced the writing of Beer Money. The Lover by Marguerite Duras. The Art of Time and Memoir, Sven Berkertz. Fierce Attachments, Vivian Gornick. The Situation and the Story, Vivian Gornick. Stop Time, Frank Conroy. Just Kids, Patti Smith. God damn you. I should have known. I should have fucking known. Patti Smith. Well, that's it, bud. Body.